done with the announcements. I'm going to get the recording started and we're going to start our conversation. So I would love to introduce Dr. Christina Collins and give you a little bit about her amazing background. She is the core faculty for talent development at Texas State University in San Marcos. She's also the Associate Director for the Lyndon B. Johnson Institute for STEM Education and Research, whereby she serves as the co-PI for NASA STEM EPDC, the Educator Professional Development Collaboration. Woo, that's a mouthful. All right. Dr. Collins earned her Ph.D. in Educational Psychology and her Ed Specialist degree in Gifted and Creative Education from the University of Georgia. Her research interests include STEM identity development of underrepresented students, positive impact of effective family and community engagement structures in STEM, and multicultural gifted education. With a military and corporate background in STEM, she also boasts over 30 years of teaching and leadership experience in various educational settings. I am so excited that you're with us today, Dr. Collins. Thank you so much for joining us. And just from the few minutes we spoke earlier, I want to talk to you for hours. So
thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to jump right in. I'm really excited about the title for your keynotes. I'm just going to start to give everybody a little excitement to think about this. It is going to be an ecological perspective on meeting the needs of gifted students. And it's really a lot of research that you've been working on. And instead of me giving the description, I was hoping maybe you could just give us just a little bit of background on how you've been working in this area.
Right, thank you. And thank you so much for having me and joining us, Jessica, and being my host for this conversation tonight. I'm really excited about coming to Colorado. So my research, I guess just to give you some quick background in terms of my research in gifted education. Of course, I started out in the K-12 setting, a high school teacher teaching gifted students, and I am a parent of two identified gifted sons, one of whom is twice exceptional. And so I would like to say, sometimes I say my research is my me search. And it's, because so much of my personal life is tied into it, that it is personal. And so whether it's my work and my passion working with children that I had as a teacher or my own biological children. And so again, as I began to just sort of study, as I try to prepare myself in terms of professional development as an educator, I just began to try to delve more and more into the research. And how I got here in terms of talking about this idea of, giftedness and bullying and twice exceptionality from Brofenberner's work, which is, of course, a psychologist that you learn about, and as an educator when you're talking about human development. I began to look at this idea of the conversations that I began to hear about giftedness as a social construct. Saying that, it's all a social construct, whether you're talking about somebody's intellectual ability or disability, or I like to call, whenever I talk about disability, I put the DIS in brackets because it's a continuum, and how to put that in context around whether it's our social norms or our society at the time or the different influences surrounding it. And so as I began to just study more about that, it led me back to some work that I had remembered when I was first getting my educator certificate. And that's looking at Brofenberner's work and looking at how children develop in terms of their surrounding and their environments and what affects them.
That is fabulous. I knew you'd do a much better job at, giving that background than I could. So I would love it if you could address those academic, social, and or emotional needs that may be associated with those characteristics of gifted students in how it falls into Brofenberger's ecological systems.
Yeah, sure. So what I would like to do, if you don't mind, I do have a PowerPoint that I can share that
Yes.
I sort of just use to guide that conversation. And I'll start by sharing a couple of the slides, and then I'll just have the slide available for reference in case someone had questions or to, as a visual for our conversation, if you don't mind.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Share away.
Okay. So I will do that. And I'm always mindful of we checked and we rechecked, but making sure that it still works. So let me see. You should see my PowerPoint now.
Yes,
Do you see that?
do.
Okay, awesome. So again, and I'm just going to leave that on the side and not go into full screen so that I can see as well. So, so two books that are recently come out that I edited this with Dr. Pinsky out of Brazil. One on autism, around autism in special education and gifted ed from both of those perspectives, which is that conversation around twice exceptionality and thrice exceptionality. And then, of course, identify, preventing, combating bullying, gifted ed. And so this is the conversations that I'm having with you today. You can find out more in both of those texts. In terms of our conversation for tonight, as I talk about it, the social and emotional aspect of it, we want to talk about sort of from a cultural context, because we understand that, culture play a huge role in everything we do, whether it's, the culture of the school setting, the culture of the home, or the culture of friendships, or whatever the case may be, but that, that shared understanding that culture exists. And from Brofenbrenner's work, we know that we're all members of multiple and overlapping cultures. And he talks about, child development from the individual child and microsystems and exosystem and macro systems. And then, of course, over time, and he calls that the chronosystem, and how all of these things may affect student development. And so, as you noted, my work before getting into gifted education so much was around STEM. That was my background in terms of my professional. I was an electrical engineer before I spent some time in the Navy. And so I have a STEM background. And so a big part of my work that I sort of created as an intersection of this has been identity development. What makes someone something, or some field or some occupation? What makes them, what makes someone see themselves as a writer versus someone who just wrote a book? That identity development. And what I found in Brofenbrenner's work is sort of this, what this graphic tends to show you here, that here's all these things that affect it. And so the closest to the child, of course, is the family and the home. And then, of course, we veer out, but there's also things like the history, and there's laws and policy that also can affect students' identity development. And that is framed within that context, understanding that as a child develops and their identity develops, from a school perspective, that it is integral and it is so much a part of and almost inseparable to the content they're learning. And so there are some researchers out of University of Chicago. And so they have, and the author is Valeras, Valeras, is the primary author for that work. And they talk about something called CLIC, content learning and identity construction. And in this work, and these authors' work, they talk about how the more centered a student is to the content or the subject or the topics or the process of learning, the more influence that has on that student's identity. And that is very important to understand that, especially in the student's formative years, right? And so if you go back and look at the context in which you see it here from a cultural perspective, as Brofenbrenner talk about it, that the family and the home is that first system. That's going to be, that most influential system in terms of identity development. And then, of course, anything beyond that is about matching or mismatch. And that's sometimes where you start to see some of those characteristics that we see. E. Paul Torrance talks about personal disturbances. We may see it as a kid just acting up in class, or, something of that nature. But there's so much in the context, and is an intersection of it all. So back more specifically to your question around characteristics, it's a very complicated from his perspective, is a very complicated way of looking at things. It's not just about those traditional things or limited to those things that we think about when you talk about gifted, those characteristics that we say, or the precocious, perfectionism, that type of thing, this idea of inquiry or motivation. Those are some things that we see when we're trying to test or identify a student, typically in gifted education, right? But it's so much more involved in that. And so this is the framework in which I use sort of to talk about and to frame my work.
That is fantastic. I love the visual as well. It helps so much with that. And I'm excited to look at the University of Chicago work too and see how that plays in. I'm curious, since you mentioned it, how can we identify the giftedness a child may have who many have not been pre-identified by the school systems? How can we bring, because it is so complicated, what are your thoughts, especially with using this background to do that?
Yes, so very good question. So first, understanding, and again, I'm always going back to shared understanding, because that's it's important to understand the context in which I have these conversations, right? That if giftedness is a social construct, that means that there is no right or wrong definition, right? And that's where sometimes you see the misinterpretations, that sometimes you see the controversy that we have. You will hear things like, well, all kids are gifted, right? We get that all the time in different settings. And so I think that it's important from that first understanding, we're talking about it from a social construct. And whenever you're looking at a social construct, then that's looking at the environment and going back to this work that you have here. As you talk about in that case, then manifestation of that giftedness, right, depends on two things. Number one, what are you looking for? And number two, what do we value? And so sometimes when it comes to those students that have been unidentified or that not are identified as much as others, it's a matter of not necessarily valuing or being able to see what it is that student bring to the table as a strength. In some of my presentations before, if any of you are familiar with my work, I sometimes do this thing here where I'll wave my hand in front of my face, because that's something for those of you of my age or my generation, John Cena, the wrestler, he talks about, you can't see me. And he always waves his hand in front of you. But, he's talking about this idea that sometimes our eyes are wide shut. It's because we have framed our information, and we frame that definition and limit it to sometimes not only to what we value and what we have been taught to see in a limited capacity, but in a school setting perspective, it's also sometimes based on what services we can provide. I tell parents all the time, your child being gifted is way beyond just the school in which he attends. And as a parent, you want to be equipped so that you can advocate for your child and to have them to participate in ways that are far more and beyond just the school setting, because some schools are limited in the way that they can service a child. And so therefore, if the school is limited in the way that they can service a child, then their identification for that is going to be sort of surrounding what those services are. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely, definitely. And that brings me to actually something that it's a little off of, not really, it goes with what we're talking about, but we spoke about it before we got on the Facebook Live. And I think it's such an important area. And I'd love to hear you share a little more about it when you're talking about how can an environment really affect everything for especially a gifted student around even being able to be set up to minimize that bullying, or to just be set up so that the students can be successful, how important that environmental piece is. And I'd just love for you to chat a few minutes around that, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So in our book that just recently came out, and I'll put the actual link in the chat as well. But in the book, our book is Identifying, Preventing, and Combating Bullying in Gifted Education. And many people say, and I know the first thing you hear sometimes is that, well, all students, are at risk of, engaging in or being a target of bullying. And that is true. But our focus for this text is that the gifted child and within gifted education. And so I think it's important to, again, sort of share with you some shared understandings around what I mean when I talk about this idea of bullying and the school system, as you mentioned before, to the differentiate between what we consider bullying and victimization. And so when we talk about bullying in this text, we talk about deliberate and repeated acts of physical, emotional, or verbal abuse, and it can be direct or indirect actions. And so when you talk about those characters, usually you're talking about peer-to-peer bullying, that bullying that we experience from interaction among people. But then there's also victimization, and that's causing someone to be treated unfairly or made to feel as if he is in a vulnerable position. And it's a lot of times can be attributed to the environment. And so we can set up an environment where that child is more vulnerable. And sometimes it can be our policies, it can be the simple environment, it can be practices where we're sort of blaming the victim or attributing the unjust treatment of that victim or the issues that victim have as it relates to them. And I'm gonna give you a case in point. A lot of times when we're talking about trying to identify students in gifted ed, and we understand that there is an under-identification of marginalized students, of students from different, students of color, students from low income, we do understand that that is an issue in gifted ed, right? And we know that that's a complicated conversation around what we just talked about, this idea of us sort of limiting our definition of what is gifted, the way that we look at it, the way we look forward, and what do we consider and value in terms of gifted behavior and characteristics. But at the same time, even in that quest to do right by our students and to identify students, we can put our students in a position of being victimized, and we don't want to do that. And going back to my case in point, when we talk about low income students, when you're constantly having a conversation about low income students from a deficit perspective, we tend to victimize them. Anytime you bring up a student from a deficit perspective, or you bring up a categorization of a student, in this case, say low income student, and there's never any conversations around any other descriptions, say middle class students or students from affluent backgrounds, you have just now victimized students from low income as if they are the issue at hand. And then because of that, what happens a lot of times that I've seen in my work is that the approach to solving this problem ends up not doing much more good for those students, because then you're continuing that process along that deficit model. And even though we're trying to be more inclusive, you're not really being more inclusive in that effort in terms of trying to get to a point that we recognize all students and understand, and especially when we're talking about trying to make sure that teachers have a skill set in being able to identify how gifted is manifested in different students, right? Going back to that low income student as a personal example, I grew up in a household where we weren't considered, we weren't affluent, and it would be considered low income by the federal definition. And so one of the things that I find a lot of times when you're talking about student and their abilities and their potential, you'll see a measure of that conversation around, are there books in the home? Right? And if there are not books in the home, that's some type of indicator of that student's potential or their ability to be successful. And that's a very limited way of looking at it. And it victimizes those students that may not, that may, or their families can't afford those books that we're talking about. And as if that's the only way that knowledge can be gained, as if that's the only way that a student can be more diverse in their learning or more what we call well-read, right? And so I think those are the options that we're talking about. So I think it's very important, again, to understand the difference between bullying that we traditionally talk about, but that idea of victimization that the school or the classroom can sometimes play a role in. And because gifted education or giftedness is sort of the thing that is not a right for all students, and you have to be identified to participate, we sometimes find that bullying and victimization does happen to our students.
Oh, that is an amazing example. Thank you so much. I mean, it explains and gives it a real face as to what it looks like in practice. And we do see that a lot. And so I would love to kind of jump off of that to ask my next question, which is, if someone feels that their child is gifted, but the school doesn't provide services for them, what can the family or the parents do to make sure that they're appropriately challenged or that they have some of those opportunities?
Oh, really good question. And that goes back to extending that experience and those opportunities outside the classroom, right? And even if that school, and I would even go even further to say, even if the school offers services, that we don't want to, as parents, limit our children to just the services that the school offer. Because again, that child is gifted 24 hours a day and not just during the hours in which they're at school. And so you want to find opportunities where you can either complement what the school is offering, or sometimes you have to create opportunities because the school cannot offer what your child needs. And so I would say look for resources. In terms of resources, the most important resource I have found for parents in terms of being empowering is each other. The conversations that you have with each other, you really learn the most from each other that way. Those personal conversations, being able to identify and really relate to how one child or one parent may, work with their child at home. But then there's also resources like the National Association for Gifted Children. They have two really good magazines, as we call them. They are scholarly magazines. They are peer reviewed, but they are written in a way that a lot is practical. So there's two. There's one called Parenting for High Potential, and then there's another called Teaching for High Potential. And in those, you have many scholars that write in those or write for those magazines. I've written several pieces for them as well. And so they provide a lot of good information and resources and links and activities. And then, of course, there's different programs out there. You have programs. I know the Duke Tip was, a very infamous program that a lot of students can participate in that that's not necessarily attached to the school. I know that recently the Duke program may no longer, or they're sort of dissolving that program, but some remnants of it still exist. A quick Google of Duke Tip, which is the talent identification program. There's still some remnants of that in different schools. There's different programs like there's, John Hopkins have websites, and a lot of the universities have websites that you can also attach to. I know that in the state of Georgia, and you may have in a lot of universities similar to this, but this is just one that I'm familiar with, Georgia State University has something they call Saturday Scholars, and students could participate in that. It was designed for gifted students. However, because, the administrators also understand and respect this idea around and understand unidentified students as well. A student could participate based on certain scores, ITBS scores or some other way to show giftedness, or they could come in a trial year and just participate as the parents sign them up. And then, maybe that second year offer some more concrete evidence around that identification process. But there are many programs out there like that. Many universities have that. I know University of Washington have programs like that. There are even residential programs where students, where there's that accelerated opportunity in terms of academics, but there's also that creative side, because we don't want to forget that. And a lot of times I know our schools, and sometimes our parents too, we tend to focus on just that cognitive ability and academic achievement in terms of giftedness. But our child is so much more than that. I always talk about, when you're talking about servicing your child, whether it's the teacher or the parent, you always want to think the head, the heart, and the hands. You want to nurture your child in the way that they think. You want to nurture the child in the way that they feel, in the way that they relate with other people, and what they do. And so all of those things are important, because our child they don't come to us with just this 6-part, the brain right here, right? It's a whole child. And that's how, you want to be able to nurture them and look for those different settings. Another great opportunity that I've been involved with, I've had the opportunity that I came across by accident, and I'm still there today. I ended up being the president of that organization, is SENG, and that's supporting the emotional needs of the gifted. I was looking for something to use as a orientation for my parents in my school system in which I worked, and we didn't have anything formal. And it was a book study, and I came and I just, and I became a facilitator, and that's how I became engaged. And once I was introduced to SENG in the conferences, I found myself still there, because as a parent, first and foremost, that was most valuable to me. And along the way, and I committed my time to that. So they have what they call SMPGs, which are SENG model parent groups that are really nice, where you get together with parents over 6 to 10 week period, and you sit around in a circle and you use a book sort of as an anchor book, how we do when we do in the classroom, our students, when we're doing the, those bibliographical, activities where the parents can just talk about things and with each other. And, you have someone there just to facilitate those conversations. And I want to reiterate that, because I think the biggest resource that parents can have is each other, because you're going to be there to support each other. You're going to be there when you need each other. Those moments when, you just feel like I just need a shoulder to cry on right now. You know what I mean? And so, because I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I say, you do the best that you can until you know better. And when you know better, we do better. And that's what we do as parents. And as parents, I do want to add this last thing too, that we have to give ourselves some grace. I never say that gifted child is going to be okay, because then we tend to say that, okay, we can put them and not do those extra things that are needed. But we give ourselves grace, and I'm saying that as a conversation to myself as well. So, they say you teach best what you need most. And so a lot of things that I'm sharing with you is not just me as a researcher, as a scholar, but the lessons that I've had to learn as a parent as well. And that, you just continue to grow, and you grow with your child, and you grow with your ability to foster and do the best that you can for them.
Oh my goodness, I'm frantically writing all of the things down, because I completely agree. I found SENG in the same way as a parent prior to being a professional in the area. And I think you're exactly right. Those connections that you can have with others and those conversations are extremely beneficial. I mean, they're totally necessary for us to keep our sanity, and for us to be there and be supportive of our children. So, and I am so appreciative of you saying it's the head, the heart, and the hands. That is huge, and giving some grace. So I just kept jotting things down, and I'm putting stars next to everything. So, so I appreciate your perspective as a professional and as a parent. It's really important. So I would love also for our next question, we'll maybe do a couple more questions, and then I'm going to peek in and see if we have any other questions that have popped up in the chat. But I would love to have you maybe explain a little bit about how it's best to advocate for our twice exceptional or thrice exceptional children. And also, if you could just give maybe a little background for those that might not know what a thrice exceptional child would look like, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so again, this work started again as I personally working with my own child, who's off the chart in terms of cognitive ability, but then when it comes to processing information, and he has dysgraphia, who has some issues. And there are times when, and again, I'm starting with my personal background and my personal testimony here. There are times when there was a struggle because, he's processing information a little out of whack, but that cognitive ability, that sense of awareness is keen, but then writing it on paper. And one of the things that I found in my research, just as part of this personal testimony, is that, this is something that's prevalent with gifted boys, that handwriting, and I remember him being younger thinking that he just wasn't taking his time, and, he needed to, spend a little bit more time practicing doing more of the same thing, which was insane, right? And just not understanding that that was nothing, that wasn't going to do it. And that sort of that handwriting is what we're looking at as a physical indicator for something bigger that, but we tend to focus on that physical side of it. It wasn't the issue, but we had to look at, well, what is it that's making that handwriting that way? And what I realized was that before the handwriting, it was the speech. So before he knew how to write, when he was 3 and 4, we found that in the speech, but as he learned to write, his speech tended to correct itself. And so it wasn't until, one of his second grade teacher brought that to my attention that I realized that it's not about the speech or the handwriting at all. It's that cognition and that processing that he's having an issue with, and it was important that I worked with the teachers that may not have been gifted certified, that did not understand twice exceptionality, meaning that you're gifted, but you have some other learning exceptionality, because gifting is considered a learning exceptionality. Anything that's exceptional to what we consider the general classroom setting, right? Or that anything where that student would need additional services beyond what would be the typical whole group setting. And so that's where I found myself. And so with this work, I started to delve into that because I wanted to understand, and I felt a little guilty all those time. I made him redo that writing assignment. And so as I started to look at that work, I started looking at work of Joy Lawson Davison, who she was the first person that I saw start to talk about thrice exceptionality. And so and then adding again my understanding and that social aspect of it, because for me, that social emotional aspect is a part that I can never separate from the cognitive piece. And so what you see here is sort of this idea of how it shows up from a social perspective as social constructs. So that gifted piece, that's a learned exceptionality. And if that student also have any type of disability, and we're talking about disabilities beyond sort of physical those physical things, those physical disabilities or those things, but a lot of times those intellectual concerns that we may have with the students, right? And so that would be sort of twice exceptional. But also, if we're going to consider this a social construct and we're going to talk about things that are exceptional to the rule, we have to also consider other social categorizations, which led from this twice exceptional book to our bullying textbook, right? So it sort of led from one book to the other as we got into this research a little bit more. And then that environment from a social perspective. So from a definition perspective, twice exceptionality is usually that intersectionality of learning abilities as a continuum of abilities and or characteristics of giftedness. Again, from a social construct perspective, they're not as discrete and neat as sometimes we like to think that they are. And I'm going to go back really quickly, even in Bronfenbrenner's circle here, these concentric circles, we see there's these concrete lines, but there's a lot of intersectionality here. There's a lot of influence and there's a lot of overlap. So I don't want you to think that this graphic sort of is an indicator that these things are happening discretely in terms or separate from each other, but they may be happening at any one point in time as an intersectionality. And so when you talk about going back to this social construct, then twice exceptionality then is this idea that a student can have a strength in one area, but there's also these areas of concern or extra need that they have. And that's how I like to present it versus a disability. But then there's the thrice exceptionality or 3E. And that's when you're adding not only those learning exceptionalities, you're taking into account those learning exceptionalities, but you're also taking into account that cultural exceptionality as well. And that's anytime that is presented in a way that there's an underrepresentation or there's a deficit perception about that. As a case in point, if you have a student, a Black student in a gifted ed program, and he is, say, 2 of 50 kids, and there are no other Black students in that program, a lot of times that student's culture is going to be an exception to the rule as well. And so that student in that position is a thrice exceptional student. A lot of my work, when I do my work in STEM and engineering and science, especially in the corporate world, we see females a lot of times underrepresented in STEM. And so that's, in that case, that is an exceptionality, because that culture, when we talk about that female culture versus a male culture, and in the STEM world, we call that the chilly environment. And what do I mean by that? I mean that a lot of times there's these policies and there are these systems and there's these processes that are put in place that we think of them and we take them to be the norm, or we take them to be just absolute. And we don't take in consideration that there is some culture behind that in some cases it's called the chilly environment because it's the way that the male culture is separate from female culture, right? And we hear that all the time when we talk about things like men are from Mars and women are from whatever that book is that, that I'm misreading here. But, as that idea. So when I talk about that, that's important that, again, I'm talking about it from a social construct. Now, why is it important that I talk about it from a social construct? Because then for me, and what I posit is that the solution is starting to look at our students from a neurodiversity perspective. right? And not from a deficit perspective, because oftentimes when we take on this idea of twice exceptionality, we're looking at it and say, okay, this student has a weakness, or this student don't have something in addition to a strength. But if we tend to look at it, if we start to look at it from a continuum perspective, then we won't put a lot of our solutions, or our approach to our solutions will be a lot different. And so giving just additional information around this, some concepts and approaches that contribute to sort of this victimization I talked about earlier, that attitude that we take, as I just said, where we talk about them being a deficit and not just different. Going back to, again, say that low income I talked about, as I think about it in reflection, my low income status wasn't an issue for me. It was an issue for the teachers, or for the system in which I was in from an education perspective. And then they put that deficit onto me and tried to make me feel as if I was less. And it may not have been intentional, but it did, right? Whereas, so sometimes some of the deficits that we put onto our children, or we displace, or I think that we put into place, are not necessary, and they're just different. And we have to start looking at that. And we look at it from a diversity perspective, that's the case. Also, assessment. We have to look at our policies and our practices. And that goes all the way back to looking at the history of gifted education. I think one of our biggest issues, contemporary issues that we have sometimes with our gifted education programs, and the controversy around it, is that gifted education had been used a lot of times to make up for what our system didn't have, right? So if my kid wasn't getting what they needed in their math class, then I think that if I get them identified gifted, then I can get them accelerated. And that has to be the case. And that's not what it's just about, because there's, we want to equate it and make up for what we don't have in terms of that academic opportunity. And that's not what giftedness is about in terms of, the characteristic of the child. And then, of course, accessibility. We know that, the issues with stereotype threat that we talked about, this issue of, like I just mentioned before, where someone, until someone brought it to my attention that I was poor, right? Or that I came from a low background, that it didn't bother me. But once someone told me that it should, and then stereotype threat came into play, right? And then, of course, the acting white and the cool pose. And a lot of that, not so much as culture, but when you look at it from a systemic perspective, from when I'm talking about in gifted education, if our white students or our majority students in gifted ed, then of course there's going to be a visual that those are the people that belong. And those are the people that are more gifted. And so then, of course, there's going to be, situations where students are going to feel that I need to mimic that behavior so that I can gain the same access that they have. And it's not about acting white or acting anything. But then on the opposite side of that, there's this opportunity where a student don't want to be seen as different. They don't want to be outed, right? I call that the Superman syndrome, right? Where you're naturally gifted, but you're trying to hide it so you can fit in. And so you see things like the cool pose, where they're trying to fit in, play it cool, and not let you know who they are. And also there's times when students don't feel safe enough to let you know who they are. Those are your strategic learners. Those are your students that are going to do enough to get the right answer to give you what you want. But those students are dying inside as well, and I talk about that as a form of victimization, because they, we're not allowing them to flourish because we're trying to keep them in that box, right? And then, as I mentioned, that Superman syndrome. And then, of course, as we mentioned in our conversations, before we came on air, was the accommodations, that colorblind environment where we want sameness and we want every kid to look the same, act the same, be the same. And sometimes it's because we need it for organization's sake, we need it, for classroom management's sake, but we have to look at how all of that affect our students and who they are and their relationships within that classroom. Because again, going back to, as they are learning, they're also constructing their identity. And that's important for us to understand that as well.
Wow, that is amazing. And I love Superman syndrome. That's exactly
my favorite. That's one thing I would have an opportunity, because I have to just share again this testimony. When I was teaching, I would teach 9th grade accelerated math for gifted students. And, the first day of class, my students would come in and, most of the students in the class had been formally identified gifted. And I would ask them, what are your gifts? How do you get in this program? And they didn't know. And I would say, my second question, well, how do you know that I'm nurturing? How do you know that I'm doing right by you and making sure that you're going to reach your potential if you don't know what your gifts are? And so we would have this conversation. Of course, I would always try to find ways to connect with my students, and we would, talk about comic book characters, right? And I would always say, I'm Team Superman. And how is it that Superman is different from any of the other characters? If you look at, Batman and all those other male gendered, again, I'm talking about those male gender, which is an issue in of itself, right? Superheroes that we grew up with, or that I grew up with, most of those, something happened to them, right? So they were humans and something happened, or they had access or money in Batman case. And then that's how they got their superpowers. But Superman was different, right? He was, and not that, that I always say that he had it was a part of his makeup all along. But he did not allow himself, even Superman, to maximize his potential for the sake of trying to fit in. And it happens to our students all the time too.
Oh, so true. And when you brought up the STEM, I was thinking, actually just down the road at the Colorado School of Mines from where I am, they've been working a lot to bring in some different programs for elementary girls and middle school and high school girls. And that's something that when you're talking about that thrice exceptionality, that was a really interesting aspect of it too. I'm very excited to listen to your keynote too. I'm so excited you're coming to Colorado.
I'm excited to be there and talk a little bit more about this idea of identity development, because I think that's important. I talk about when I'm sharing with teachers, or even when I'm talking to students sometimes, I know that, our system and our way of being in society, a lot of times, especially in our school system, I think we tend to tell our students, if you do this and do this and do that, you can get this and get that, so that you can have and then become. And what I like to challenge educators to do is let's do the opposite of that, right? Let's stop telling our students, if you study hard, you'll get good grades so that you can have a career, so that you can be this thing, right? Because what I do know, and is that it's in our beingness, is that we want our students to grow into that. And so when I'm teaching my students, or if I'm doing a training, I'm challenging that status quo. I'm challenging that narrative. And I always say, it's who you be. And I know that's not the standardized English, right? That's not correct from a standardized perspective, but it's who you be, right? It's in your beingness. And we want to talk about being first, and doing that the opposite way. Step into that beingness, similar to that Superman syndrome. Step into who you are. Be okay with it. Because sometimes it takes us being courageous enough to be different, or to show who we are, to give that next person the courage. And that's one thing you and I just talked about as well when it comes to bullying. And again, you can see how this one book led to the other, right? Because if a student is hiding that gift for the sake of not being different, sometimes they are bullied only because they do have that courage, because sometimes our students show up as a mirror to those around them. And so it may be that, man, I'm a little jealous, or I'm a little, I'm not as secure and confident to be able to show up in who I am totally, right? My authentic self. And so as a part of that, the bully may say, okay, I need to control your behavior, because what you're showing me sometimes is a potential that I have that I'm not ready to even access, or I'm not ready to go down that journey yet. And so we have to look at that from that social construct perspective. And so I'm going to talk a lot about how identity is developed as students are learning, so that content learning and identity development at the same time.
Oh, that is perfect. And actually, you just answered like the beginning of my very last question that I wanted to pose. And so it was, what is it about gifted children that I don't know if the wording is right, make them more vulnerable to bullying, but I think how you just described the identity, that really that puts it into a really good perspective and a lens for that. And just so everyone knows, make sure to look at the chat on the Facebook, because I put the link to Dr. Collins' newest book, Identifying, Preventing, and Combating Bullying in Gifted Education, in the chat. So make sure that you check that out. And I would love to kind of have our last little section definitely be whatever you make sure you want to share with us before we go, but also if you can help us as parents or teachers or even the students themselves, what can they do to minimize or deal with some of that bullying behavior without, that victimization. So, and it looks like you have an amazing slide, especially concentrating around those 2E kiddos.
Yeah, so from, formally speaking in terms of models and systems and things of that nature, I have that slide there about how to combat that, again, around, these thinking models, neurodiversity, cognitive diversity, cultural diversity, embrace it, allow students to, step up and be who they are. And as teachers inside that classroom, be willing to give up, that control, be that facilitator, that guide on the side, and allow your students to flourish and take an active role, not just in learning, but teaching as well. Because, it is in those moments that, and when you allow students to show up in their authentic self, they're going to bring their culture with them. And if you set an environment where they feel safe enough to show you who they are, and I'm not talking about that student that's going to make just a straight A, that we're going to measure who they are based on the grade, but that student that you can tell by that light in their eyes, by the way that they're engaged, by the conversations that they're having in that classroom, by the synergy that's created, that when someone else step in the room, that they just feel like they step into a place that's just totally different. That's when you're doing that right thing, and stand on the side and trust the process and trust your students. And I know that's hard to do, especially in a time where we're depending so much on standards and high stake testing. But what I tell you that, for those of you that teach gifted students, you really have an opportunity here, because you can compact the curriculum for our students. A lot of times our students can go through that curriculum with or without you, right? But it's guiding them in that identity construction that's going to be the most important thing. It's that talent development beyond that textbook that's going to be that most important thing, that's going to take them and not only make them productive citizens, but to also help to guide and lead the way in a lot of this work. Curriculum and instruction, I think, being a bystander is just as bad as, that bullying process. When, if you see something, say something. And I don't mean it in the frame that, okay, we're just going to go and tell, right? But this idea of that, be willing to make a difference and be willing to model that change, as we say, that you want to see. And then, of course, multicultural gifted education. I know that there's a lot of controversy around the world and around America, around, this idea of critical race theory, anti-racist theory. But what I want to challenge you to say that multicultural gifted education is mainly about human respect. It's about, and when I talk about respect, I'm talking about respectful task. That means those are tasks that the student has that should be appropriate, a student that help that student make meaning, and an opportunity for them to make a difference, right? As well as get to know who they are. That's what multicultural gifted education is about, is that and that competency around perspective helps with critical thinking. And so, and I know that we want to put it, and we can use all the different terminology and all the words we want, but for me, it's about human rights, human respect, and respecting our students with respectful tasks in such a way that they can maximize their potential. And we're going to guide them with their goals and what they want to do. I always tell, my students that, I love math, and I know all of you may not love math, but it's students that I teach. Math is just a vehicle by which I do that. It's how I get their attention. And because I love it, I'm going to put more into it. And so that subject that you teach, I tell my teachers, that's for you. That's so that you can enjoy what you're doing, so that you can maximize your abilities and your opportunities to reach a student. Because when you love what you do, you're going to put time into it, because it's not work at all for you, but it's the students that you teach, not that subject. And so that's important. And that service learning adds that emotional learning. I think it is in our nature as humans to help each other. And I think we saw that when we went through COVID. We saw a society that put all those other things aside. We saw a society that was willing to come together, no matter what side of the aisle they sat on, no matter what their beliefs were around certain things, because we saw that we were all in this together. Energy isn't created or destroyed. It's just transferred, and we are all in this together. We all are a part of one another. So helping our students to teach them to help each other, and service learning and global learning is such a great way to just do that for our students, and especially our students that a part of their characteristics is to have sort of this concern for justice, and have this concern and have empathy and want to help. And you see that in our gifted students. And so again, I don't want to give away my whole keynote, so I'm going to leave it there and just tell you that, of course, you can get the book. We have another book coming out around twice exceptionality. I have it with Dr. Karen Arnstein, again, Dr. Piskey, and it's with Springer's, our publisher. And so that will be coming out probably in the spring, or by the time I reach you guys in October, that it should be out, a book on twice exceptionality as well.
Oh my goodness, that is fantastic. I love it. I'm going to pop us both back on. Definitely, I will try to pop that other resource link over too. And I just got one last question. If you have any other resources that you think might be helpful for us, any of your other work, but definitely I cannot wait to read all of your books and also hear you as our keynote. But if you have any last things that you have worked on that you'd like to share, we would love to know where we can go to find all of your amazing work.
Yeah, so I do have at Texas State, we have what we call WordPress sites. And I have 2 sites. I have one that's focused on STEM development, which is, and I'm going to put that in the chat for you. And it's called Mentor Matters. And it shares some of the work that I've done around STEM development. And also I have one called Creatively Gifted. And on that site, I have an article that I share, as well as an example of a parent roundtable that can be used. It can be scaled. Teachers can use it to do parent orientations. Parents can use it. And I use it's a book that's not recent, but it's one of my favorite books. I think it's simple. It is funny. It's a book by, and I share this book with everybody, and I don't get any kickback or anything. And Karen Isaacson doesn't even know me, but there's a book called Raising Brains by Karen Isaacson. Mm-hmm. And I love that book. It is funny. It is a good read. She talks about it from a professional, as a parent perspective. And I use it for my parent orientation sometimes when I do parent roundtables or orientations. SENG has a great one, but I love this one sort of as an introduction sometimes, just to learn about gifted characteristics for parents. And so I just want to share that for you. So I'm going to try to, I have all of these windows up. The one I'm putting in first should be the Mentoring Matters in there. And if I can't get to the Creatively Gifted, you should be able to get to it from that website up. I think I just found it, which is good, because on that site, I give instructions and it says it's been archived. But I'm going to put the link, and you may have to play with that link a little bit to get back to the actual site, because it's showing that when I pull it up just then, that it said that it was archived, but it's active. And so I just want to.
Wonderful. Well, I am sharing them as we speak, and I'm so thankful that you've taken the time to join us tonight and give us a little preview of the amazing information that we're going to see as a keynote, as well as some great resources and books that we can all use. And I appreciate that so much. And we just are so glad that you were with us. And I hope you have an amazing week. And I hope all of you out in Facebook land have an amazing week as well. And we will say goodbye for now, but we will see you soon.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you so much for hosting.
Of course. Of course. So wonderful to meet you. All right. Have a nice night, everyone.
Bye-bye.